Hey there everyone, welcome to the stream today. I'm Josh Justice, aka Coding It Wrong, and as I always say, you can watch for yourself and then decide if you agree that I'm coding it wrong. I'm here today with something very exciting to go through. I'm very pumped about it. It's something I've been working on for years now, and I'm excited to announce. I've announced already, but we're going to go through it together today on the stream. And it's a book that I've written about test-driven development. It's called Outside In React Development, a TDD Primer. We're going to be going through the first example chapter from this book today, just to kind of show you what it's like to give you a sense. But I want to also offer this link here on the stream. You can go to see the book on LeanPub where it's available to learn more, or to get a $5 discount. So that's 20% off, offering to folks watching this stream or recording later a 5% discount. What the heck? No, $5 off, 20% discount. Let me not undersell it. So please check that out. There's a free sample of some intro chapters as well, some kind of theory chapters. Yeah, and the cool thing about LeanPub is that the books are DRM free, and so you're not going to lose access if you lose your Apple account or Kindle account. But the book's available for Kindle, Apple Books, and PDF, all as a part of one purchase. Okay. Vishal, it says sound is low today from my side. All right, let me turn that up. Vishal, let me know how that's sounding now. And glad you're here to join in, as well as to let me know there. And if I put this a little closer, that'll help. So hopefully that'll be a bit better. Yeah, so let's talk. We're just going to do a little bit of introduction, talking about the concepts of the book and the concepts of test-driven development before we jump into the exercise together. So when you talk about test-driven development in general, there's a kind of unit test loop that you go through. There's 3 steps. First, you write a failing unit test, and then you make the test pass by writing the code that's necessary to make it pass. And then you refactor. You take the opportunity to make changes to improve the code or improve the test or change it up. And then you continue. You go back to write the next failing unit test. That's test-driven development as it's usually described. As we're going to be going through, and as the book describes, is another kind of approach called outside-in test-driven development. And this approach adds a second loop called the end-to-end testing loop. So in this approach, first you write a failing end-to-end test or acceptance test. Then, in order to get it to pass, you go into the inner loop and you do a loop of writing a failing unit test, making it pass, and refactoring every time you get an end-to-end test failure. So the end-to-end test guides you through step by step through multiple unit tests in order to get the end-to-end test to pass. So after each inner loop, if the end-to-end test is passing, great. Otherwise, the end-to-end test tells you the next step, the next behavior of your app to get working. And this is a great way. A lot of times folks wonder how many end-to-end tests, how many unit tests should I write? And this approach gives you a great way to know how to make them work together to get the strengths of both. So I want to talk about why TDD, why you might want to take this unintuitive approach. I'm going to describe it quickly here, and then we're going to revisit it again, if I remember, at the end of the stream, the end of the exercise, to see if we saw some of these things in practice. So test-driven development, number one, it gives you regression safety. So when you add tests after your production code, as is common in software development, it can be hard to write tests. It's like, I don't know how to write a test for this code. Or it can be hard to fully cover the functionality. How do I get to this line? How do I cover this case? I don't know how to test this line. So when you're writing test-driven development, you get that coverage from the start. You kind of tackle those challenges from the start, and they're easier to go through so that you get thorough regression safety so that you know that your app is covered by tests. Also, with test-driven development, it's easier to write the tests because you write them first. You're writing code that is testable. Number two, you get robust tests. So when you're writing tests afterwards, it can be easy to write tests that break any time you change your code. And that's discouraging because then your tests aren't giving you a lot of safety and it's costing a lot. But when you do test-driven development, you're thinking about the interface of your code first before the implementation. And as we'll see today, you write tests that just think about the interface of your code, what are the inputs and what are the outputs, and all of the internals can change. And those can be refactored and improved over time. So you get these tests that are robust to change so that they're helping you instead of harming you as you need to make changes to your application. And finally, test-driven development helps with speed of development in several different ways. TDD guides you towards the simplest implementation of your code so you don't have unnecessary details. It guides you towards the simplest interface that's easiest to use. With TDD, you can do that refactoring that I described to improve the design of the code at any time to be able to work through it. And also TDD helps you prevent writing code with a lot of dependencies, because you see that during your testing process. You write code that's less coupled, and so it's easier to work with in the future and easier to understand. So that's a lot of big claims. We'll see how much comes out as a course over the course of the exercise that we're doing together today. Okay, so the last thing that I want to say before we... Oh yeah, no, let me show you the web page. So if you check out the link right down there, or it's in the, if you're watching this recording later, it'll be in the video description. You'll get information and get a link to the book with the $5 off coupon, so check that out. This is the page here on LeanPub, and if I scroll down, I just wanted to show the table of contents. So in the book, there's this concept section, which is a lot of theory about including why test-driven development in a lot more detail. That's available for free as part of a free sample. So if you want to get that theory info, go for it. Then we have this extended exercise, this 7-chapter exercise. There's an about chapter, so it's really 6-chapter exercise. And we're going to be starting out with the project setup, and we're going to be doing just the vertical slice. You can see there's 4 more chapters, and then 2 sort of going further chapters at the end to take things further. So if you like what we're doing here, you can learn more in the book. Okay, so let me show you what we got and what we're going to be doing. In this book, we go through an application for and build out the first couple of features of an application for rating restaurants and dishes at restaurants, because I like to go to restaurants. I have opinions about the dishes there. It's called Opinion 8 because I like puns. And right now we have an empty application. It just says hello world. There's nothing there. It's built with Create React App, but I've got all the testing tools installed and set up and ready to go. So we have a backend already in place for our application. I've set it up with this UI here so that as you're using it through the book or through following along with the exercise, you can sign up, and you can just kind of sign up for a free API key. So I've got one here. I'll invalidate this after the stream, so please don't try to jump in and add a bunch of embarrassing data that I'll need to filter out later. But this lets you list restaurants from the backend, just with the name, and it lets you create new restaurants, and there's instructions there. So I've already created this API key, so when I go to that page, that URL, I can just go there in a browser, and I get a couple records back, a pasta place and a salad place by default, are the 2 restaurants that I have. So that's JSON data from our backend coming back, very typical in web development, and we want to build an application that works with this data. And our very first feature, when you're using outside-in TDD, you want to build one small bit of functionality, user-facing functionality at a time. It's called a vertical slice. So we're going to build out and test drive out all the pieces of our application necessary to do one useful thing for the user, instead of building the whole data layer at a time or the whole UI at a time. You do one little vertical slice, and your end-to-end tests help to guide you to focus on things that are user visible, because the end-to-end test shows you that they're visible to the user. Excuse me. I need a drink of water. A lot of talking. You have to listen to all this talking too. Or you can fast forward. Let's see if I'm better. Excuse me. All right, so our first user functionality is we want to display the list of restaurants from the server to the end user. So that's what we want to do first. So the first step in the outside-in TDD loop, let me just pull up my little cheater notes here. I've got the book up next to me. The first thing we want to do is to write an end-to-end test. And we're going to, I don't know how. Okay, gotcha. There's the app. There's our code. We've got Cypress set up, and so we're going to create a new test. If you haven't used Cypress recently, so Cypress version 10 was just released, and it's a major overhaul. The UI is different. There's a lot of new features. I'm looking forward to hearing more about Cypress component testing, but today we're going to be using the typical end-to-end testing. So I'm going to create a new file here. Let me just do this. New file. In the end-to-end test folder, we're going to call this listing restaurants. cy.js is the new file extension for Cypress 10 by default for tests. Oh man, I got my ESLint error. I should be using VS Code like the rest of you, but I'm not. So let's just try this again. See if this works this time. Nope, yeah, our linter is not going to be working. Well, let's try one more time. It might have worked that time. I don't know what that voodoo is. All right, so we got our end-to-end test listing restaurants. Okay, so let's just write this out. So the first thing we're doing in our feature is writing out an end-to-end test for the functionality. What is the user-facing functionality we want? And we can just say it shows restaurants from the server. Okay, so what do we do here? So first, I'm going to define a few variables we're going to be used in a few different places. Place equals sushi place. Pizza place equals pizza place. So that's our two restaurants in our test that are going to be coming back. And we're going to be using the Cypress intercept API. This has been in the last few major versions of Cypress. This has been in place as an API, the API for stubbing out backend requests, because we're just testing our front-end application altogether. We're stubbing out the backend, and that's important to allow these tests to run reliably on CI. Okay, so we're going to say api.outsideindev. So instead of putting in my API key in the intercept call here, I'm going to put a star, because our test doesn't really care about the value of that API key. We just want to know if a request is made to the server for restaurants, here's what we get back. We're going to say ID1 name sushi place, ID2 name pizza place. It's nice with Cypress, you can just kind of fill in a JavaScript object structure there. It'll turn it into JSON, which turns back into the JavaScript data in our code. So we're stubbing out our backend request here. The next thing we want to do is just simply Cypress visit the home page. And just as a note, here's the updated new Cypress config file format for Cypress 10, and I've defined the Cypress base URL because that's where our application is going to be running, localhost 3000, so that I don't have to specify it in my end-to-end tests. I'm going to say Cypress contains sushi place, and Cypress contains pizza place. So that'll ensure that these restaurant names are displayed on the page, and that should be enough to let us know that we are in fact listing restaurants from the server. That's a pretty simple test, and it's great if your initial end-to-end test is pretty simple like this. So yeah, let's give it a try. Here's the new Cypress 10 interface where you're choosing end-to-end testing or component testing, a beta. I've already clicked on end-to-end test. No, I've quit out of end-to-end testing, so let's reopening it. We're going to open it in Chrome. Open up over here, and we've got our listing restaurants test. We're going to click on it. Machine is choking a little bit with all the different technologies that are going on, but let's see if we can get this going. Try to get everything running from this before the stream, and then you get distracted. There we go. All right. So our tests are loading. We are able to visit the page, but instead of seeing sushi place, we just see hello world. And so we need to work to get sushi place to be displayed on the screen. All right, so what do we do? So I want to talk about the layers we're going to use for our app, because we are thinking about, for production application, how we want this to work. So the layers we're going to use are pretty simple for web applications and a lot of different kind of client-facing applications. First, we're going to have a UI layer implemented in React. Then we're going to have a data layer. And for that purpose, for this book and in the tutorial, we're going to use Redux. There's a lot of other data layer options, a whole lot of other data layer options. One of the nice things about Redux is it has a really clean separation between your components and your data layer code. And the interface to them is just plain JavaScript. So we're going to see that the testing of those uses normal promises and async await, and it works very nicely. So whether you use Redux or something else, I would encourage having a strong separation between your UI layer and your data layer. It works out a lot better for unit testing and for portability in the future, because then you could replace your data layer in the future with something else. And then we're going to have the API client layer to be separate, just something that makes the calls to the server. All right, so we're going to build from the outside first, as far as we're letting the end-to-end tests let us know what to do, and we're going to build starting in the UI layer before we do anything else. Another thing that we use that's typical in outside-in test-driven development is a principle: write the code you wish you had. So you think about, instead of building everything out, or instead of starting at a low level, you say, okay, in my application, what's the code that I wish I already had in place that I could just write and call a component or a function that would make things work out really well for me? And you write the code you wish you had, and then you let the test drive you towards implementing that. So we're going to do that together. So thinking about our application, all we have is just our app component with a hello world in it. Okay, well, we definitely don't need that. That's not needed. So what do we wish we had? Do we want to put things directly in the app? Well, in a real application, we'd probably have some routing going on, but we're not going to do that for right now. But aside from that, other than an app, you probably have separate screens. So let's go ahead and put that concept into here. Let's say we have maybe a wrapping div. Not technically necessary, but let's say we had a restaurant screen component. That's a component that I wish I had. So how would we pull that in? Restaurant screen from maybe components directory. Yeah, so I wish that I had this code because that would help me to be able to build this a bit better. So let's go ahead and save that. We could rerun the test, but I know it's going to error out because they're not there. So let's go ahead and start building out this component. Components folder. I'm going to misspell restaurant screen so many times. Why did I choose this example for my code? All right, so what do we do in the restaurant screen? Let's say we got it, and then let's just return some placeholder content for the moment. I'll just say h1. Well, this would be good to have here. Restaurants. One thing about test-driven development is you don't need to think about all the visuals at the same time. You can do one thing at a time. So I'm really trying to write the minimal code that will get the test to pass, and that gets me the structure that I want, but I'm not worrying about styling just yet. We'd be able to refactor later to do styling. Okay, so let's stop at this point because now we have one component, the restaurant screen. Let's just rerun that end-to-end test, and when we rerun it, we see the restaurants showing up, so that shows us that it's there, but again, Sushi Place is still not being shown. So what's the next thing that we want? Well, in our restaurant screen, there's more than just the list that we're going to want to do. We're going to want to be able to add a new restaurant as well, maybe delete them in the future and stuff like that, maybe some other information. So I don't really want to add that list directly to the restaurant screen itself. I want a child component. So we can call that restaurant list. So let's add that here. We're writing the code we wish we had. Yeah, so I wish we had a restaurant list component in the same folder here. We'll save that. Now let's make that work. And here let's again just do a very simple component. Default function. All right, let's rerun our test to make sure that that shows up. And it does. That placeholder text is going to go away. Excuse me a second, let me just mute. Tickle in my throat. Okay, so we've got the components set up now. So how would we want this restaurant list to work? Well, in a Redux approach, you typically have a connected component where you would have the restaurant list pull the data out of the Redux store, and also probably trigger an action. So that the list, when the list appears, we tell Redux, hey, we need you to asynchronously load this data from the server. So let's look forward towards that. Yeah, so in order to specify that functionality, that's not really something that the end-to-end test specifies. It doesn't specify that a component needs to do something, but we do need to do it. So now we're stepping down into that lower loop, that unit test level loop, to test drive some of the functionality we want restaurant list to have to move us towards being able to satisfy this end-to-end test. So to do that, we're going to create a component test here. We'll call it restaurant list spec.js. We can put it just in the same directory. Now we want to specify this functionality. So we're describing restaurant list, and we're saying, what does it do? It loads restaurants on first render. All right, so we want to specify how to say load restaurants on first render. Well, first we are going to need a fake function because we're testing our component in isolation from Redux. And so we just want a function prop, an action prop that's passed in that we're going to call. We call it load restaurants. We're going to use just mock function. We're going to provide a mock name. We're going to see in the test output that giving it the name there makes that test output more readable. Okay, now what? We want to import render from testing library React, and we want to import the component. Okay, now we're ready to render it. Restaurant list, load restaurants, and so we're going to pass in that function, just like Redux is going to do, pass in that action to the component. And then what are we specifying? Well, we want to expect load restaurants to have been called. Note that our test here isn't specifying that the restaurants are being rendered, because that's not the behavior we're talking about right now. And when it comes to this component connected to Redux, it's kind of two separate things. It's call the load restaurants function, and it's display the restaurants that are passed in. So that separation there helps us to kind of keep these two different aspects of the component separate. So let's start with this. We just want to specify that when the component is rendered, load restaurants is called. We're going to run yarn test. All right, we get a failure, which is good. This is what we want. In the test-driven development approach, first we want to write a test and watch it fail. Then we want to write the minimum production code to make the test pass. So we're getting a failure here, which is what we wanted. We expected, now check it out, it says expect load restaurants to have been called. Expected it one or more times, but it was only called 0 times. It wasn't called at all. Okay, so now we have a failing test. We need to write the production code to make this pass. All right, we're going to do that with a use effect. Now in our component, we're going to say use effect. And no dependency. Actually, there's going to be a dependency. It's going to tell us that. I think the linter is going to tell us that. But we need to take that load restaurants prop and we need to call it. Let's see if the linter tells us that it's a dependency. It does. All right, we can follow that advice to exhaustive dependencies. We put load restaurants in there. But this should be the minimal code to get load restaurants called as a result of this component being rendered. We save, and the test passes. Jest's watch mode is very helpful for test-driven development because you're going to be very quickly creating failing tests, making them pass, doing refactoring to make sure the test still passes. So leaving Jest in watch mode is absolutely what I recommend for a test-driven development approach. All right, so we have gotten this test passing. We are calling load restaurants when restaurant list is mounted. Great. All right. Okay, now we want to do the second behavior. Just loading the restaurants isn't enough, and that's not actually going to help us get our Cypress test to pass. We need to display the restaurants as well. So let's specify that. Let's say it displays the restaurants. Now, how does that work? We're going to want that load restaurants function is going to be called. So we're going to want a no-op function here, which is just a function that does nothing. And then we want an array of restaurants. And again, I'm just going to copy and paste that from over here. Yeah, sushi pay. Oh, I'm going to need this. Just the string there is fine. Okay, now we got that. Then we're going to render restaurant list. Load restaurants equals no op because we don't, for this test, we don't need to do anything with load restaurants. Restaurants equals restaurants. So we want to pass them in the way that mapping state to props works with Redux. So that's how the restaurants will be made available to our component from the Redux store. And again, really kind of here, we're writing the code we wish we had. This is the approach we would want our component to take to be able to work with Redux. All right. So now, how can we assert in the rendered content? We're going to use the screen object from React Testing Library. We're going to say expect screen get by text sushi place to be in the document. And in the same way, we're going to say pizza place as well, just for completeness. So if these restaurants are provided as a prop to the list, we expect them to be shown to be rendered. So because we're doing test-driven development, we don't think this should work yet. We expect our test to fail because those are not present, and then we'll make it pass. So we save, the test run, we get a failure. Let's make sure it's the failure we expected. Unable to find an element with the text sushi place. So that's the failure we expected. Now we can implement that. I do want to make one note here about a principle that's come up in here. Load restaurants in first render and displays the restaurants. We could have tested that all in one long test, but there's a general testing approach that's also followed a lot in TDD called check one behavior per test in unit tests. Sometimes this is described as make one assertion per test. In Jest we use expect rather than assert, but it's a similar principle. But you'll notice in our code here, we're doing more than one assertion. We're checking for two different text things of text in the page. But it is one behavior. These are very closely related because it's just checking that two different things are shown on the screen. Whereas checking that load restaurants was called is a very different behavior. It's very separate. And so we're following this principle by saying checking one behavior per test in unit tests. And the advantage of doing that is when you look at our test output here, over here, our behaviors of our component are listed out in the test output. It's like we can see, oh, our restaurant list is successfully loading restaurants on the first render, but it is not successfully displaying the restaurants. And then we'll get that working. So that's one of the best benefits of one behavior per test is you get a nice description of the functionality of the component. It kind of serves as documentation for you to understand what the tested bit of code is intended to be doing. So one behavior per test in unit tests. All right, so let's make this pass. Let's close this other stuff. So we want to take that restaurant's prop and we want to render it out. So what are we going to do? Probably, again, pending styling that we might do later, let's make it a list. And we're going to say restaurants map restaurant. And it's going to be a list item. We want to give it a key. Cool. So this should be enough. Maybe we want to display more data later, but all of our tests is specified is that the name of the restaurant should show on the screen. And so this, using a little bit of semantic HTML for a list, this is kind of the minimal code to get both of those displaying. So let's say we expect our test to pass. It does not. Oh, well, hang on a second. Let's see what's going on here. We scroll down. Unfortunately, this is a lot of output, but we look at the list here. Actually, our displays the restaurant test is passing. It's our load restaurants on first render that was passing before that's now failing. And let's see why. It says cannot read properties of undefined for restaurants. So what's happened here is initially we didn't need the restaurants passed in for that first test, but now we do, now that we've made the second test pass. And so we can make that succeed just by passing in some dummy restaurants here. We can say const restaurants equals empty array, because that's all we need here. We don't need anything there. We just need whatever's needed to make this not blow up. And that is realistic for that point in the component, is that an empty array would be there for the restaurant. So we pass in that prop, save this, and I think this should cause the test to pass. Both tests to pass, and they do. Great, so now we've gone through a unit test loop to get everything we needed in our restaurant list layer to be able to display the components. So from here, we need to move on. Now we need to step up. So we've driven out this restaurant list component. Let's step out to show that loop again. We've gone through that loop on the right there of writing several failing unit tests and making them pass. And now we're ready to step back up to the end-to-end test level to see what is next there. So let's do that. I'll run our end-to-end test. And now we're getting this error, cannot read property map of undefined. So we're not actually getting restaurants passed into our component. So what is the code we wish we had? How do we want the restaurants to make it to the component in our app? Well, it's through Redux. And so that means our end-to-end test has driven us to the point that it's time to install Redux. So let's do that now. I'm going to do that here. And I've got a specific pinned version of Redux just to make sure that everything is good. It's important for a published book so that things don't break on you too much. 8.0.2. So Redux and React Redux. We're going to need more a little bit later, but we're doing just enough now to get things hooked up to get past this current error of reading map. So how can we do that? Definitely, Redux is complex enough. I'm definitely going to need to check that reference to see how. So in our restaurant list component, and again, I know we have some general Redux setup to do, but let's work inside out. What would be needed to get restaurant list what it's needed? So let's start out here. We're going to import connect from React Redux. We are going to, well, let's come back to that in just a second. We're going to define map state to props. And if this isn't familiar to you, you can check the Redux documentation to see how this works. So basically, when state is passed in here, we want to take back restaurants. That's the missing data that we don't have. It'll be listed under a restaurants reducer, and we'll call that records there because we're going to have some few other bits of data there. So we've mapped state to props. And now export default connect, map state to props, passing in restaurant list. And now that that's the default export, we don't need to export this. We can just do a function. Let me make sure. Yeah, that's what I do here for this step. As a note, Redux does have a React hooks-based API that we could use. But one of the nice things from a test-driven development standpoint is the old Connect API for Redux allows things to be separate. You have this pattern where you have this unconnected component, and then you connect it. And so this unconnected component is really good for testing the component in isolation. So we're going to take this approach and see how it works out. All right, so we're going to save our changes here and see what our test does, our unit test. So our unit test says, could not find store in the context of connect restaurant list, wrap the root component in a provider, etc., etc. All right, so how do we want to make the Redux store available to this component in the unit test? The answer is we actually don't. We don't want to test our components in connection with Redux. We want to test it separately. We have this nice unconnected component that just takes some simple props that don't care about Redux, and we want to test it that way. And so the way that we can do that is change what we're testing. What we can do is export this restaurant list, this named component, as a named function. This is a common pattern in Redux testing. And then when we import it here, we're going to import the named version instead of the default version. This version shouldn't care about Redux. It should just allow us to pass in the props simply. So let's save and do it. And our test passes. So this is great. So we now have a default export that's connected to Redux and a named export that happens here. In the restaurant screen, we're still using the default export, so that should correctly hook us up to Redux. So let's go on from here and see what happens in our end-to-end test, stepping back up and seeing what happens. Now we're getting the same error. Could not find store in the context of connect restaurant list, wrap the component in a provider. So in our full application, what do we want to do about this error? In our real application, we do want to have a provider. We do really want to hook it up to Redux. So let's do that now. Let's let our test drive us to hooking Redux up. We're going to start out in the app component. Is that where we want to be? Yeah, that's where we want to be. Okay. We're going to import provider from React Redux. We're going to import store from store. So the code we wish we had. We wish we had a store folder. That seems good. That's a common pattern in Redux. So that's where we want that data to be. So from here, what we'll do, we don't really need the div anymore. So we're just going to go provider store equals store. Provider. And we could run the Cypress test, but we know we are going to need to define this store. So let's create that folder. Store index. And this is going to have a lot of the Redux setup that is typical for this original style of Redux. Create store. And you know, it's not like the tests are driving us and showing us every single detail of Redux. Like knowing the library is important to be able to do this. And that is fine. That doesn't violate test-driven development. So with Redux, you have a root reducer. And we get that from our reducers folder. And we're going to add more things to this file later, but this is all that our test is driving us to. This is what we wish we had in order to get this Redux data available. So we'll save this, and now we're going to make this, let's see here, a reducers file. Different ways to structure this data, but I'm going to do it this way. Import combine reducers from Redux, import restaurants from. So restaurants is going to be a sub-reducer, sort of a nested reducer in our store for storing all of our restaurant-related data, because probably there would be user stuff and other stuff in a real application. Combine reducers restaurants. Now combine reducers is a bit overkill at this point because we only have one child reducer, but this is the code we wish we had because this gives us space at our root reducer to add more child reducers in the future. So we're thinking about, for a production grade Redux application, how we would set this up. So again, we're kind of starting from the outside, working in, defining all the things we need. Now we need this restaurants folder and the reducers. Yeah, okay. And we're going to get a combine reducer again. And now we're going to take the approach of having individual functions for each property of our reducer. Now, remember that the end-to-end test that we're trying to fix is the fact, well, this is attached to Redux, but before that it was that list of restaurants wasn't defined. So the minimum we need right now to fix that end-to-end test is just to return an array of records from here. And we're going to export default, combine reducers with records. So once this is all hooked up, this should be the code written the way we would like to get all the pieces and the files that we want with the structure we want, but the minimal vertical slice to get the test passing. So let's rerun that Cypress test and see if we've gotten it all hooked up successfully yet. So now we get another error, load restaurants is not a function. So this has actually gotten us past the previous point. So it seems like, and I'm pretty sure, this list of restaurants is being made available, the initial list of restaurants, so it doesn't blow up there. But then in the effect, when it tries to call load restaurants is not there. And we want to write the code we wish we had to understand how to load the restaurants. And with that, we're going to use Redux thunk for our asynchronous actions, because that's the kind of simplest and recommended way to do that. So let's add it. Yarn. Okay, and again, pinning the version to make sure everything's good. And we're really trying to follow that approach of only writing the code that our test is driving us to. Now that our test is driving us to, we need to load that data asynchronously. Now it's time to add Redux thunk. So let's try to remember where that's going to go. I think it's in the store. Yeah, it's in the store. So let's configure thunk there. We need apply middleware from Redux. We need thunk from Redux thunk. And we're going to stick that in here. So Redux thunk will be available there. And now we need to wire up that component as well. So in our restaurant list, how do we want load restaurants to be provided by Redux? Well, we want to import that action. We're going to load restaurants action from store restaurants actions. That's the file structure that I want to use there. And then that's going to be in const map dispatch to props load restaurants. And just pass that in the connect. Now we need to actually implement this action too. Because of the way thunks work, we're going to have a function returning a function that does nothing for now, but that's the right structure that we're going to need. Okay, so let's rerun that end-to-end test. Again, we're just trying to get past the error that load restaurants is not a function. We're not trying to implement that function yet. So we're going to rerun and see if it's wired up. All right, all our errors are gone. And so now our function is able to get an empty array of restaurants. It is able to call load restaurants, but then nothing ever changes. No restaurants ever come in to be displayed on the page. So in order to do that, we're going to need to implement our store, and that means stepping down to a unit test level to unit test the store. So let's see how we do that. We're going to take an approach here of unit testing just the whole restaurants subreducer together. And you'll see what that means in a moment to put that together. So we're going to say describe restaurants. And we're going to say describe, because there's ultimately going to be multiple actions. So describe the load restaurants action. How do we want that to work? It stores the restaurants. So that's the behavior that we need for right now to get our end-to-end test passing. Is we need the load restaurants action to store the restaurants. There's a bunch of edge cases that future chapters get into, but this is the key we need for this vertical slice to get it working. All right, so let's just copy and paste our restaurant data again. I mean, if it was more than trivial, you could put that in a shared place, but that's enough for here. It's okay to copy and paste it, and because the data doesn't need to be the same. So remember, when we talked about our layers, we talked about a UI layer, a data layer, which is Redux and Redux thunk, and then an API client layer that will make calls to the back end. So we want to make that API client available to our store. Here's how we could do it, and we can write the code we wish we had. We wish that we had an API object that had a load restaurants function on it, and we can just put a stub one that's not real, but that just provides the data we need. And we can say when that function is called, return a promise that resolves to the records. So that this is a kind of a fake version of our API. We're designing out the API. Oops, not records. No, records is what I call it here. It's not the real API. It's a fake version for this test, and then later we'll build out the real one. We're thinking about one thing at a time, thinking about our store right now. All right, so knowing the structure of a Redux store, what we're going to need next is an initial state. We'll start out with records as an empty array. And now we're going to create the store itself. So unlike in the full application, we're only going to pass in the restaurants reducer, not the full root reducer. That lets us test our separate child reducers independently. But we are going to pull in the Redux setup to create a real store. So we're going to get create store and apply middleware from Redux. We're going to import thunk from Redux thunk. And we're going to import restaurants reducer from restaurants reducer. Yeah. All right, so let's set this up. Const store equals create store. Restaurants reducer, that's the first argument to create store. Just checking my notes here. Initial state is next. And third, we have middleware. So we say apply middleware, thunk with extra argument API. Now we didn't write this before, but thunk with extra argument is a way to inject a dependency into Redux thunk. It's a way to say, hey, here's an API, and you can use that as a part of your asynchronous actions. And using this kind of dependency injection approach is helpful for testing, because here, instead of using just module mocking, we can just pass in our fake API that's used for testing. It's nice and straightforward. All right, now that our store is set up, we want to actually call it. Oh, looks like we're going to need an async action, actually. We want to await store.dispatch load restaurants. And that, is this something we want to import as well? Yeah. Load restaurants from restaurants actions. Yeah. So what do we want to do after we call the load restaurants action and we wait for it to finish? What do we want to be the case? Well, we want to make sure the restaurants are stored in the state. So we say store.getState records, because it's the name of the child property in the restaurant part of the store, to equal records. Now we're writing test-driven development, and so this test should fail at the start, so we're going to save this and watch it fail. Save it, and we say, okay, load restaurants action stores the restaurants. We expected the array with sushi place and pizza place, but what we got instead was an empty array. All right, that's because that's the initial state of our store, because nothing's being done in load restaurants. Now we have the unit test that has specified what we need to happen in the load restaurants action. So let's implement that. Let's make this test pass by making it work. All right. So in load restaurants, we need some named actions for basic Redux stuff to do the storing. So let's call it export const store restaurants. Then in here, we're going to need to make it an async function and take some properties. Dispatch, get state, and then that extra argument is API that shows up there. That's what gets us our API. Now we want to get our records, and we can await the call to API.loadRestaurants. So that's what makes that call to the server. Then what do we do with those records? We dispatch a store restaurants action passing the records. And that needs to be an action creator, so we need store restaurants that takes records and returns an action of type store restaurants records. So this is very straightforward. Redux here and Redux thunk up here, very typical if you've used these libraries before. Now when we save, it's not going to pass yet because we're not doing anything with this dispatched action. In the reducers, we need to do something with it. So we need to import store restaurants from actions. And then in our records here, we need to say state equals default state action, and we need to switch on the action type. If it is a store restaurants, we need to return the action.records. So that becomes our records is what came in the action. But by default, we just return the existing state. So this is what does the overwriting that is going to make our test pass, I believe, unless I've made a mistake. So let's see. We save and the test passes. So this means that our load restaurant action is really storing the restaurants. When we call load restaurants, if the API returns those records, they will be stored into the store. All right, so we've unit tested our store level, the vertical slice, just the bare minimum needed for this end-to-end test to pass at the store level. So we're going to jump back up to the end-to-end test level, run it again, and see what happens. Okay, so now we get type error, cannot read properties of undefined, reading load restaurants. So that's just a matter of wiring again. Actually, I'm assuming that. So let's find out what's happening. Go in the console and rerun it. So this is in actions.js. So load restaurants, await API load restaurants. So this, I use the same name for the name of the action and the name of the property on the API to make the call there. But this is saying that the problem is actually in api.loadRestaurants. So we don't have an API client load restaurants function. And that's the case because we haven't done anything about building out our API client layer. So our end-to-end test has now driven us to say, okay, time to implement the API client. So let's do it. All right, we're going to put this in directly under source in just a file called api.js. In there, we can say, we'll call it, make it an object, and then we need to define that property, load restaurants. And just to get that end-to-end test to pass, we're going to make it a function that is a no-op, that doesn't do anything. Save that, and we rerun our end-to-end test to make sure the test the error changed. Well, now it says cannot read properties of undefined reading load restaurants. And that's, I'm remembering, we've created this API but not done anything with it. We need to wire it up to the store. So let's go into the store index. We're going to import our API. And then we're going to use that, instead of just thunk, we're going to use that with extra argument API. In our production code, we're passing in the real API module, unlike the fake API module we used in our test to give our store test isolation from our real API backend. Sorry, our real API client. We save. Jamin, how's it going? Glad you're here. Trading stream. Well, you had me as a guest on your stream. You're just in the chat right now, but I'm really glad you're here. I'm walking through, doing some test-driven development, and we're getting close to the point of having our first end-to-end test passing. So let's see if I've successfully wired up the API client at this point. Hit rerun, and now we're getting a different error, and that's what we like to see. We're just doing enough implementation to move past the current end-to-end test failure. When called with an action of type store restaurants, the slice reducer for key records returned undefined. And what's happening there is, this is the fact that our API didn't actually return anything. It is undefined. And so when we, in our action here, when we await this, async await syntax is okay with the fact that it's not actually a promise. It just gives us the return value over here, which is undefined. But the rest of Redux does not expect that and does not want the undefined records in there. So this is driving us in this error to actually implement the API client. Jim said, knocking out some email. We'll have you up in my other display. Well, great. I'll be sure to make trolling statements to get your attention every once in a while. All right, our end-to-end test has encouraged us and required us to implement the API client here. So how are we going to do that? Well, I want to use Axios. I like Axios as my HTTP client library, so let's add it. We could use fetch, but I am finding, so this is funny. In the book, I wrote about how IE11 doesn't have the fetch API built in. So actually just today, as we're recording, June 15, 2022, Microsoft has made Internet Explorer 11 end of life, which is the final version of Internet Explorer. And so that doesn't mean people are going to stop using it. It's still there, but there's now an official statement from Microsoft like, please stop using Internet Explorer 11. And it's a big deal. There's some really cool low-level JavaScript APIs that Microsoft Edge and all the newer browsers have that JavaScript apps are going to be able to take advantage of the more that people move away from IE11 because it's not actually able to be polyfilled. But as of this moment in time, and still for a while, a long tail of time, there will still be IE11 out there. And so that's one of the benefits of Axios is that even if the fetch browser API is not available, you can still use Axios. All right, so let's implement that here. We're going to create a client. I always like to use Axios create to specify a base URL, and we're going to specify it here. So our backend was at api.outs. side in.dev. I got to get my API key here. I'm going to put it in. And yeah, at the base URL level here, we just configure this because this is sort of the root URL that all our requests go underneath. And then in load restaurants, we're going to make it async. We're going to say response equals await client.get restaurants. So it's going to get the restaurants path underneath this base URL. And then we're going to turn response.data, because in this response is an Axios response object, and the data property underneath it is where the response body goes. And Axios will automatically take the JSON formatted data and turn it into JavaScript objects. That's one of the nice simple things about Axios using that. All right, so we save this. And let's run through our end-to-end tests. Now that we have our UI layer, we have our store layer, and we should have our API client layer as well. We click Run All Tests, run through, and it passes. Our end-to-end test passes for the first time. Pyramir in chat says, hello, hello. Twitch is telling me you is a first-time chat, so glad you're here. You have not joined before. We are doing some test-driven development to build out a feature and an application from the book that I recently published, Outside In React Development. And there's more information at the link right there you can check out if you like. So we've just got our end-to-end test passing for the first time. So that's very exciting. We stepped through one step at a time to first build out the UI layer, and then the store layer, then the API client layer. And again, just a vertical slice, just the minimum at each level to get this passing. Now I do want to step back and comment on something important. You may have noticed, and I didn't comment it on the time, that I did not write a test for the API client layer. I just wrote that in response to the end-to-end test. So why is that? This is application functionality, and I've been doing unit tests, low-level tests up until now. Why not here? Well, when you're writing unit tests, it generally is for logic in your application, conditionals, things that are happening. This layer is a very small pass-through where we're really, our call to api.loadRestaurants is just kind of calling through to the Axios API, making a call out and returning something back. And so our end-to-end test actually serves to make all of this work together. If our end-to-end test passes, that ensures that whatever's happening in the JavaScript, ultimately that HTTP request that we configured here happens and comes back, and that sushi place and that pizza place come back. So when it comes to an API client layer, and it's really ideal to have API clients being as small and simple as possible. If you have something more complex that you need there, make that another layer that you unit test. But when you have this kind of very low level wrapper, that allows you to just have your end-to-end test cover it, and you don't need to unit test it at that level. Pyramir says, I'm trying to get motivation for more software development. Well, cool. I hope this is motivating. Test-driven development is very motivating for me because it allows me to work in very small steps. And as we have been doing, and you'll see as we go along a little bit later, I love the fact that in test-driven development, I always know the next thing that I need to do because I write the next test, or the test has failed and it tells me the next thing that I need to get passing, and I just take one small step at a time. And there's actually a real dopamine rush. I don't know if adrenaline rush? Probably not adrenaline. Maybe it's dopamine. Anyways, I don't know brain chemistry, but there's a feeling that you get from seeing those tests go green as they're going now. Our unit tests are passing, our end-to-end tests are passing, and that encourages you, hey, cool, I've made some concrete forward process. And when building a whole feature feels overwhelming, writing a test and then making it pass can be a lot more approachable. For some folks more than others, but it definitely is the case for me. All right, so we've made it through our end-to-end test loop where we wrote that failing end-to-end test. We went down to the unit test level to test drive some lower level functionality, and we did that several times until we got to the point where the end-to-end test is passing. So that's great progress. But we haven't actually looked at the real app running against the real backend. So our test is passing, but let's make sure the real thing really works. We've got our Opinionate app here. Let's reload it. Restaurants comes up, and Pasta Place and Salad Place come up. You may remember that's the slightly different place names that I am getting from the real backend. So the request is making it to the real backend. Cool. Let me just make sure what I want to show next here. Yeah, so let's make sure just that mocking is not happening here, that the real request is happening. So we got our network tab here. Reload. And we can see here something interesting. In the network tab, 2 HTTP requests are actually happening. And if you're up to speed on the latest React version 18, you probably know why. This is more detail than I want to get into in the stream, but there's information in the book and there's information on the web about the fact that in React 18, the React team has implemented this functionality in development mode where when you have an effect, it runs twice. And the reason it runs twice is because the component is mounted, then unmounted, then remounted. And in our case, what that results in is double loading of the data from the server. It doesn't hurt anything, and in production mode it won't happen, but that's kind of interesting that you get a different behavior in development than production. There's a lot to read about that. I've been researching it the last couple of weeks to try to understand the best practices and what to do, but there's ways around it. If you just want to disable this from happening temporarily, you can do that. It's actually a good idea to take this as a pressure to say, hey, like, what is a more recommended way to have my data layer or data loading happening in React? And React is sort of in progress now, as suspense for data loading is not yet ready for prime time for direct use. If you're using a framework like Next.js, it is ready for you to use there. So a lot of interesting stuff for how the React world is progressing, but this is good enough for now. For our case, for the tutorial, this works okay, but I'll put links in the recording when I send that out later to the React 8.18 issues so you can research and see how you want to proceed in your own applications. But it's good enough for now and not hurting us. All right. So let me see here if this is all that we did in this chapter. And it actually is. So let's talk about this because this might be a bit surprising. In the book, I actually encourage doing commits all the way along, but pushing this up as a pull request, getting it to pass on CI, and then merging it down. And you might say, wow, this is really rough. Like, all you've got working is this terrible, 1996 looking web page here with Times New Roman font. This is not what I want to ship to production. Well, one of the great things about test-driven development is you can separate out these different steps. So let me show in the table of contents for the book the things that we do separately after this. So in the next chapter, we refactor styles because even before I handle other edge cases, I got to get it looking at least half decent. And so in this chapter, we pull in MUI, Material UI, into the app, and then we style all the screens to make them look nice and cool. And actually, all of our end-to-end tests and all of our unit tests keep passing because we've implemented them just to the interface and we haven't coupled them to all the details of the markup and child components and things like that. Then we have a chapter where we handle, oops, I'm not showing my screen sharing, sorry about that. Yeah, so this is our vertical slice that we did. In the next chapter, we did those refactoring styles to Material UI, as I mentioned. After that, we have a chapter of edge cases where you say, okay, now we want to handle the loading case. We want to show a loading indicator when it's loading. And we want to handle errors as well, where if there's an error getting the data from the server, we get a nice error message on the screen. One of the nice things, so separating this out is really nice. So think about this. If you're writing this from scratch, you have to write all of that at the same time, maybe. And it's a lot to think about. Am I remembering the loading and the error? And how do I want that to happen in Redux and pass it through? And what do I want to do? Being able to separate that out into small pieces is really nice. We had the option of doing the styles before we handled the edge cases, and that could actually be more motivating. Let me make it look cool a little bit before I go and think about these kind of edge cases. The other thing that's nice about unit tests is they can make those edge cases easier to visualize, where it can be challenging to visualize loading states when you're running locally and things are really quick. In a unit test, you can simulate a request that's taken an indefinite amount of time, and it's really easy for the unit test to just stop time right there, see the loading state. Mocking out error states from API servers can be hard as well. There's developer tools, things you can use, but it's really tedious. And honestly, that's one of the things that's the most tedious for me when I'm doing manual testing is if, like, I could reload a screen to make sure that content shows up on the screen. Like, that's fine. Manual testing easily does that. But all those edge cases, like making sure the loading indicator works and it's not skipped over, making sure the error case is handled. Like, I don't want to have to slow down my network request to make sure the loading indicator comes up. I'm not going to remember or not going to be motivated to make my web request error and make sure the error indicator comes up. So using test-driven development to handle those cases makes sure for me that they get handled, and it's really helpful for my motivation. Then after that, we have another chapter where we put it all together. We go on to a second story, which is writing data. So in that chapter, we have a form that shows up on the screen where you can type in a new restaurant name, save it. This shows how test-driven development works with React forms, how we save data to a server, and the different edge cases we handle there. And so we kind of wrap it all up together as sort of a final exam with everything we've learned up there. There's a few going further chapters as well. So I said a moment ago about the API client, how I didn't really feel like integration testing it or unit testing the API client was necessary. But maybe in your application you found that it would be useful to do so. So we have a chapter where we do that, and we show how you can do that, and you can see if it's helpful or if it's not so helpful, using a library called knock. Also, we have asynchrony and React testing library. So our React testing library tests for data loading have been nice and straightforward. Everything's been clear and simple here. But when it comes to the form, things get a bit more complex. We have to do some awaits. We get some warnings, the dreaded React Act warning, which is showing up for a good reason, and we have to work through it. And so in this chapter, we talk through why is it warning us, and how can we get around it, and what are our options, and we even see some things about React testing library steering us towards multiple behaviors per unit test. And we talk in that chapter about whether that's good, whether that's bad, what the trade-offs are there. This could actually be something that would lead me to be more inclined towards Cypress's new component testing, newly in beta. There's some interesting trade-offs there to explore, and maybe in a future stream I'll get to do that. Maybe a future chapter for the book or another future book, who knows. But yes, this has been outside-in test-driven development. So let's go back to that slide about why TDD and see if we've seen any evidence of these benefits. So regression safety. So we didn't write any production code until we had tests covering it. And so now if we were at the point where any of that functionality changed, either our Cypress test or our unit test should break. And you know, there's a lot to do. There's a lot more to add in a production application, a lot of things that would need to be shifted around. And so you would, you know, those tests would help us see if we broke anything. Also robust tests. So our tests, let me show you these. We'll switch back real quick. So this is something very important in test-driven development in component libraries like React, in my opinion. So if we look at our component tests here, we're making assertions against functions that are called, we're making assertions against text on the screen. We're not asserting that the child component is an LI or asserting that it is wrapped with a certain style, a certain MUI component. We're not coupling to all those implementation details. All we're doing is the inputs and the outputs. When the component is rendered, this function is called. That goes as an output to elsewhere in the app. When restaurants are passed in, this is shown on the screen. And that's what's going to allow us in a future chapter, I promise and encourage you towards, when we refactor the UI, this test stays identical whether you're using MUI or a custom styled component or Tailwind or whatever you like. This test still passes because we're testing the behavior of the component, not the look and feel. I actually think that using Storybook to visualize the components is a much better way to manually test the look and feel. And there's libraries for visual regression testing as well. But making explicit assertions about specific DOM elements or child components, I don't think that's useful. That's not helpful to get robust tests. Also, speed of development. This one doesn't look so good from what we're doing here because I'm test driving something very simple that I'm sure if you have experience with React and Redux, I'm sure you could have written that faster than I did just here. And also I'm explaining my test-driven development, which doubles the slowness of it. If you're going through and working through test-driven development in the book or doing it on your own for the first time, that'll be slow as you're kind of thinking through it in your head as well. So in the short term, test-driven development does not speed up development. But in the long term, having the confidence to be able to make those changes, having the confidence that, so think about this, you get an app and you realize, an edge case wasn't handled very well, and you're going to need to do significant rework to handle that edge case. Are you going to do it and risk breaking something and risk having to manually test the whole thing all over again? Probably not. You're using MUI and then you realize it's not working for you and you'd rather be using Tailwind, or your designer comes in and wants you to do custom CSS. You're going to need to change all of the styles. Are you really going to want to do that and risk breaking all of it, making sure the loading indicator, making sure the error message still comes up? It's a ton of work. But when you have good test coverage that confirms that everything works together, you can do those more rapidly. So in the long term of a project, when you are maintaining it, adjusting it over time, building one bit at a time and building it out, test-driven development is going to speed up your development over time, I would say. That's hard to show and prove in just one stream or even in one book. But the things that are in place, as you think about your applications that you maintain month to month and year to year, I hope you see the benefit of TDD that would provide for those things. Again, as I said, this is the book again, Outside In React Development, a TDD Primer. There's the link again to learn more and get the $5 off or 20% off coupon for watchers of this. And again, the testing edge cases, refactoring styles, forms on writing data, RTL challenges are all additional things that you'll get in the full book. So I hope this was helpful. I hope it was interesting. Maybe not. A lot of people do not prefer test-driven development, and that's okay. But I would even encourage you, even if you're not already sold, you're not sold like, oh, test-driven development looks so awesome, it's definitely going to help me. I would encourage you to give it a try, whether through the book or another resource or in your own trying. Try out test-driven development so that you can feel it out over a course of a few different features. And then you can see, maybe you decide, well, not for every feature, but maybe for some. Maybe not for your side projects, but maybe for your professional projects. Or maybe just for certain things. Maybe you only want to test drive your data layer, but you don't feel like your component layer needs it. You know, by learning test-driven development, you've got another tool in your tool belt that you can now use, and you can decide for yourself. Whereas when you haven't tried it, you don't have the information to decide if you want to use it or not. So give it a try. If it's this book, if it's something else to learn test-driven development, I think it's good to learn to have as an option for you. Jamin says, I just need to get my brain to think tests when it is thinking build. That's a great point, Jamin. And actually, I should say and confess, but it's not really a confession because it's not really a problem. It's not 100% of my applications that I always write the test first. Something else that's mentioned in the book, but I'll give you the information here, is the concept of a spike. It's the word's used a few different ways, but in Agile circles, the concept of a spike is used as, hey, I'm not sure exactly how this is going to work. I'm just going to build it out. I'm not going to write tests before or after. I'm just going to try it. You know, if you're new to Redux, you would not know all the things that we did just now. You would want to figure it out. Like, let me just see how I could get this working. And so you could write out that Redux code to start. Maybe you just hack it together the simplest possible way, and then you see, man, I really want this in a child file. So you do that, and maybe you do manual testing the whole way. So that would be building. But then you could decide, okay, now I've done a spike and I've figured out how Redux work. You might decide, okay, I'm going to go back, I'm going to save that code or stash that code or put it up on a branch, copy and paste it, and then you could go back and say, okay, now I'm going to write out the tests. The other thing I should say, to confess, when I'm building out applications, I might not go back and test drive those first features. I might write the tests afterwards. But then, and we saw this in the Expo stream that I did, stream series I did recently, my first feature, I wrote it out and then I added the test afterwards. But for the second feature, once I was like, cool, I know how the structure of my app works, I know what my tests are going to look like, I actually decided for my second feature to test drive it because I had less uncertainty. I kind of knew how building was going to go, and then I decided to go test first. So again, it's test-driven development is a tool you have in your tool belt, and you choose when to use it or when not to use it. Another thing that can be helpful is just to choose to do it as a discipline. It's like, you know what? Okay, today I'm going to write the test first, and I'm just going to put a sticky up on my monitor. I'm just going to try it, just to get into the muscle memory of it, and just to get a little bit of practice. And yeah, so there's all kinds of different things. Just one book and one live stream is not enough to learn all there is to do about testing and test-driven development. I encourage pairing. Jamin in the chat right now and I paired on a live stream of his recently, and we worked through testing in React Native together. Find someone, a friend of yours, someone online, someone you work with that's interested in trying out testing or test-driven development, and pair on it together and see how it goes. Well, cool. That's all we have for today. But I want to say thanks to everyone who joined. I see Vishal, Piramir, and Jamin in the chat. So thank y'all for saying hi. If there's others in the chat, I appreciate y'all being here. If you're watching this recording later, thanks for checking it out. Check out the book. Check out the free sample part and see if you want to read more. But yeah, thanks for joining in. I'm happy to contribute to the React testing world in this way, and just, yeah, enjoy your React development. Thanks. See ya.